Welcome back to another Tonic discussion. Uh, Today we're talking about accountability. So this has been a ongoing theme of some of the last conversations that we've had, and I wanted to just start us out and talk about how it relates to my conception of morality. So in some back and forths with a reader, Gabriel, and then also Cryptos's latest, there's this idea that there are means that might be a little undesirable, like lying, deceit, deception, or some other coercive means, which you know, most people would agree tend to trend towards evil, but that we should evaluate the impact. We should evaluate the outcome. We should evaluate the ends. Are the ends noble enough that they justify the means? And what I would say is this directly plays into the concept of accountability because we have a hard enough time as it is holding people accountable for their means. What do they do? Because there's not a lot of agreement as to which means are acceptable and which means are not. But as soon as we start allowing for people to justify distasteful means, things that we all kind of agree aren't noble, lying, deceit, theft, violence, in that they might lead to some noble or justifiable end. Anybody familiar with the complexity of social science, as soon as you're dealing with complex social phenomenon, how can we walk the dog between somebody's actions and the ends? How can we directly attribute what somebody did to an outcome in any sort of complex system? So this is especially pertinent for government policy. But even if you're trying to implement a policy in a large organization, perhaps your actions made undesirable ends, they mitigated them a bit. How do we know? Maybe they caused those undesirable outcomes completely. Maybe they made undesirable or bad outcomes somewhat less egregious. Maybe you get a good outcome, but it would have been better if not for the nefarious means that you employed. It creates illegibility with respect to accountability. And as long as that illegibility exists, people with the highest IQ, like especially the highest verbal IQs, are going to be able to create narrative moralizations of their self-interest, explaining how whatever means they engaged in, if you can detect the means they engaged in, were justified because they intended for some noble end. And I think that that's inevitable. And we expand that concept across time and space and look at the entire economy, look at the entire action and purpose of government and policy. And I think it should be clear that we should be really careful and maybe reject the idea that we should be looking at ends at all and trying to evaluate ends at all because there's no accountability there. It's hard enough to hold people accountable for their means. So perhaps that's where we should focus. And towards that end, my two principles that I propose to judge people by their means, and it also accounts for ends a little bit, is looking at hypocrisy and delusion. Is somebody hypocritical? Are their actions consistent? Is what you're asking. And I don't think that somebody whose actions are inconsistent, their means on aggregate can be said to be moral because they're conflicting. So some might be good. If some are good, then some are bad if they're inconsistent. And then similarly with delusion, delusion just allows you to be hypocritical without admitting as much to yourself. But it also makes it so that if you notice a consistent pattern where your actions are producing ends that are undesirable, if you're not delusional, at some point you're going to have to realize, hey, maybe these means that I'm engaging in are producing these undesirable outcomes, and reflect on that and integrate that feedback. But if you're delusional, you can always blame somebody else. So I just wanted to start off a discussion on accountability with those thoughts.
Well, let me respond because I was thinking of a couple possible like counter examples. I don't know if that would be the way to phrase it, but I want to get some clarity here. So it ties into what you just said about, okay, well, so if you, well, let's use the example of a politician that gets into office, might even be a political party, and then things just progressively get worse, right? So this is regardless of means. I think we're talking about actual established ends here. So when they actually do something that makes things worse, like I think that that's a case where ends should be taken into account, and they should be like, okay, well, whatever you did it wrong because bad stuff started happening. So maybe we should remove you from office. So I think that a distinction should be made between ends as a justification, future ends, like in the hypothetical, in like the possible, the potential, the probable, and using means as a justification for those stated ends. In that case, I totally agree with you that we shouldn't be that that's totally irrelevant. We should be looking at the means that people are using, regardless of what their stated ends are. But then we
Yes,
should also be looking
absolutely.
at,
Yeah.
yeah, we should
Yeah,
also be looking at the actual, yeah,
I do not mean to say that if we already know the ends, we should ignore
yeah,
those. No, this
okay,
is this is because before we engage in the
right,
means, we don't know the ends and we can't. So
right,
like if we already know them, then absolutely it is a factor worth considering. And that's where the delusion comes into play. Because if that happens over and over and over again, then that's strong evidence of delusion. That
yeah,
somebody that's saying, hey, I want to get after these ends, and they're consistently screwing it up so spectacularly, well, they're probably delusional.
okay, okay. Well, how about this one then? This, so I cleared that one up, but I was reading this book, a book that I used a little bit for a couple of articles I wrote on my Substack. This book called After the, I think it was called After the Natural Law, and there was a section on punishment, and it was in the context of like prisons and prison reform. And because I'd read at the same time, I was looking for data on prisons and the effectiveness of certain types of punishment, and what people think works and what people think don't work. And so this guy, who's a kind of a, I think he's a legal scholar, maybe a philosopher of law as well. And he was making the point that he did that was utilitarian thinking. He wasn't a fan of utilitarian thinking in terms of, okay, well, if we save this much doing this, then that's a good thing, and if we reform this many criminals, that's a good thing because they contributed to society. He said, no, that's utilitarian thinking, but he kind of threw that out. He said it's a moral issue, and because is it right to punish criminals? So essentially, his point, he might not agree with my take on it, but the moral I took out of his discussion here was that it doesn't matter if punishment works or it doesn't work. It's the right thing to do. That people deserve to be punished, and whether that leads to good things or bad things in the future, that's irrelevant. Like, that's kind of my extreme version of what he was saying. So it seems to me that he was saying, well, that the means are correct, and we can't know, in the future what will happen. Those shouldn't even be considerations. We should strictly be focusing on punishment because it's the right thing to do. I was just, does that mesh at all? Like, how do you how do you
Yeah,
see that comparing
I
to what
would
you're
just
saying?
yeah, I would say that the discussion there is over the means, and I would disagree with that assessment. Um, I mean, what's the purpose of punishment? If there's no utilitarian purpose to punishment, you're going to harm somebody and you don't have a reason to. That doesn't strike me as particularly persuasive.
Yeah,
So I would I think that it's still a good paradigm because it focuses the discussion where there's the disagreement. So this individual is like, I am sure that it is good to punish people regardless of anything. It's a good thing morally to do. Well, I don't know. Probably depends on the circumstances. Let's have that discussion, and that can focus our attention where there's an actual disagreement. Whereas if
Mm.
we bring in discussion of ends, like you said, yeah, utilitarian, whatever, like I don't like it. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, first let's have a discussion over why you think that the like what are the what is the purpose of this means that you're engaging in.
I think that one of the things that we need to try to do is to entangle the concept of ends from the concept of something like motives. So it's sort of like you could say, well, here's an end that I want, an end point to this action that leads to a series of actions. And through a chain of events, we'll arrive at this particular sunny upland of progress or whatever. Like one of the things that sprung to mind to me when we pitched the topic was Lysenkoism and the notion that here the end state was something like we're going to have a massive food supply. We're going to be able to feed every mouth by creating these sort of hybrid crops, essentially, using a very backwards and benighted sort of understanding about biology. And so the end was like everybody gets fed. The motive was we want to feed everybody. The end result was something quite different. The end result was catastrophe, famine, all the usual problems and bugs that crawl into a system like when you essentially have a utopian end in mind. And so it's sort of like, but what was interesting about accountability along the Lysenko project was that it kept getting outsourced somewhere else. So like eventually, yes, Lysenko sort of met his fate. But along the path of all of those errors, accountability was kind of pushed outward to people that were like raising objections, people that were noticing that the means weren't working, people that were essentially confronting the whole theory that Lysenko proposed, and also just pointing to brick and mortar evidence of its failures. Well, they got punished first. There was a long chain of punishments until Lysenko and his crazy theories were expunged from the system. And a lot of harm was done there because I think the accountability, and this relates to like the way that I perceive sort of the busted circuitry of accountability that we're experiencing today, is that it's something like a perverse risk pool, like almost like an insurance risk pool, right? And it's kind of like so the buy-in might be very large or very small to this accountability pool, we'll call it. And depending on the way that the system, whether it's a corporation, whether it's a system of law, the way that it's structured like matters because what the worst result is, I think, what we're seeing now, what we saw with Lysenko, is that accountability is actually this is even worse because what we're seeing now is the accountability curve, like the distribution curve of accountability going flat, where people essentially the buy-in is enough to render them immune from any particular end. And so therefore all means are become sort of available, including like means that contradict each other, including like all kinds of actions that are just going to lead to graft and run and corruption. And at the end of the day, like once that end goal, first of all, the end state isn't met. Instead, it's we're standing in ruins. And like when that happens, the accountability was spread so thinly across such a wide area that nobody essentially is accountable. Like that's the sort of the game. And I think we like maybe somebody could chime in because like I have theories about how that game sort of came into fruition. But like I do think it is the game that we're playing. It's sort of like where the real game that we should be playing is something like a structure where accountability is built in at every level instead of a sort of this unified, centralized Leviathan where everybody can kind of point in a circle and at the end of the day, no one is punished, no matter how bad the outcome, you know?
you
Like, I think
started
that explains COVID. Yeah, good.
you started talking about intentions and kind of demonstrated, I think, the point that I would make, that intentions are kind of a red herring, because other than people telling us what their intentions are, we can only infer them from means and ends. So really, the focus a priori is on means. After you can observe the results, then you can consider ends. But intentions, we're our our reason is oriented around moralizing our self-interest. And so all asking somebody's intentions is going to do is get the best narrative they can produce to justify their means and their the purported ends that they're trying to strive towards.
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of like, and that's why I think morality starts as a system of self-restraint. It's not, you have this abstraction of the law, this big sort of looming threat that grows all of these appendages that can actually hurt you, that can hurt your family, that can really make like a mess of your life if you step outside of those boundaries. Whereas morality is something more of akin to the ability to take into account all of the multivariate graphs and factors around you, clearly see all the options, and then choose from them the wisest one. And the wisest one is not necessarily the one that grants you the most individual power. It could be something like, okay, so it could be, for instance, a sacrifice, right? And the different systems of morality are really, when you boil them down to, is what is acceptable, what is an acceptable sacrifice? Like, what is permissible to sacrifice? And various religions and philosophies have a different answer, a different spectrum of like what may or may not be sacrificed. Um, Personally, I subscribe to the one that says only the self is permissible to be sacrificed. That would be sort of the basis of my Christianity, let's say. Other people might sort of expand that circle and say, like, well, there are other sacrifices that are permissible. And by the way, when I say self-sacrifice, I don't mean necessarily death. It could be a sacrifice of comfort. It could be a sacrifice of money. It could be a sacrifice of time or effort or any of a number of things. But absent that, like if you are in a system where you say like, well, everything is permissible as long as the end is not even achieved, but like as you said, like is something that I could disguise later. I could cloak in a narrative if it doesn't come to fruition. I can somehow displace accountability or distribute it somehow where at the end of the day, I may be punished, but my punishment isn't going to fit the crime. It's going to fall well short of it. Uh, I think that's unfortunately, I think that is the ethos that kind of drives all of the various institutions and authority structures that we see right now that are sort of roving through the world, leaving a wake of carnage and destruction in their path. And
So
like,
we're
yeah.
we're in this situation now with with the whole pandemic response where things are so backwards that, okay, so in an ordinary situation, I think, like within our history, our North American history, or even, well, I'll stick to North America. There has been, I think, kind of a focus on means, at least according to the rule of law. Like, you either you do, well, these certain things we just don't do, and then it's in anomalous situations where things happen where it's like, okay, we're in a new situation. um Now we're going to kind of change the things that we've been doing because of these new circumstances, right? So then this focus becomes on the end. We have to do this because we want this thing to happen in the future. We want this good outcome to happen in the future, and that's the justification for why we're changing the way we do things, while we're essentially breaking the law, establishing new norms, implementing these new policies and behaviors and actions that were unacceptable a year or 2 year, 3 years ago, or even or 5 or 10 or 20. So now we're in the situation where it's kind of like they get to have their cake and eat it too, in the sense that looking back on it, they can say, oh, well, that didn't work, and we have all these bad ends that resulted because of that. But you can't hold us accountable for that, because the means that we took, we had really good intentions when we took them, and we had a really good end in mind. So you can't judge us because of the means or the end, because you know you just can't. We can't be held accountable on either of them. So we're in the situation where it's where neither works. And so I think, Grant, the way, like, I hadn't heard anyone put it like that before, but I think it's a I think it's a great framework to start out from. It's is to revert back to a focus on the means. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you kind of see it the same way, that it's kind of been hacked so that the accountability doesn't work like on either end of the spectrum there?
Yeah, I absolutely think that that's the intent. Like the system depends on that strategy more than anything else. They depend on hypocrisy and delusion, and those things being ubiquitous to confer status. So like a willingness to believe in absurd things and essentially believe and comply with whatever gives, this globo homo Borg the most ability to control and influence people's lives, is what confers status. But they can't operate that way in a situation where they can be held accountable for their failures, because their failures are legion. So it is the principal means by which it's all accomplished, I think. And that's why I think we've been circling around accountability for a long time, and kind of recognizing that that's the common thread. Because if they could be held accountable for what they've done and the fruits that have been born from their means, that they're candid about. you know what's the book Nudge about? Like, just read what they've said, that they think is what's best for society. Is people are too stupid, like they're not good at making decisions, and so we can use the coercive apparatus of the state in order to influence social behavior uh, for everybody's benefit. And it's like, okay, that's a hypothesis, but that means is coercive, and it is hypocritical, because these people wouldn't want somebody doing that to them and constraining their choices. So it's hypocritical. So that should warrant extra scrutiny right there. But
Well,
then as soon as it doesn't work out, when you apply these things at the level of a civilization, how how can you hold them accountable for it? It's nearly impossible. So yeah, no, this it's not to say that intentions aren't important. They are important, but really the only way that we can infer intentions is by looking at the means and examining the outcome. And before the outcome happens, when there's policy decisions being made, all we can look at is the means that they're advocating. So it's like really where all the focus should be. And that's why I don't think that these means that we all kind of agree are immoral can ever be justified at scale. And if you want to justify them and you feel really strongly about it, then hey, maybe that's what the federal system's for. And you live in a small local community, and maybe at a very local level, people can experiment with that kind of thing. But that's not a community that I would want to live in, because I think predictably it's going to result in bad outcomes for this reason, because even at the local level, it'd be very difficult to hold people accountable. At a national level or internationally, it's all but impossible. And yes, they will always defend themselves by painting their intentions in the best possible light, which in a complex situation where analyzing the data, you could cut and slice it a million different ways, and people just don't have the numeracy in order to not be fooled by people doing so with ulterior motives. Yeah, I think that's the only way, is you got to focus on means.
Well,
Maybe there's
okay.
also no, I was just gonna say maybe there's also a distinction to be drawn, you know, between like personal morality, so how we work on our own moral stance, right, and how we look at it from a societal perspective, because I think what was discussed so far was more the societal perspective, and this is obviously important because, as you guys said, we can only infer intentions, right? I mean, it's just not possible to look into people's heads. But for ourselves, when we take moral decisions or like think about what to do and all that, I think it's actually useful to work on the intention bit as well, and just get better at it. First of all, at recognizing your own BS, right? Like your own narratives, and like how you delude yourself into believing that you have like good intentions, when in fact, you know, all you want to do is have that cake or whatever, or that guy's money or what have you. So that's I think very useful. I mean, that's not like other people won't necessarily be able to judge you based on that, right? But it's just important for yourself, and the same maybe for ends even, you know. So just what kind of goals you have in mind for certain things, and what is your experience with these goals, and what is realistic and all that. So yeah, so I think from a personal individual perspective, it becomes a bit complicated, because you cannot just judge yourself by the means, you know, because you have to kind of come up with intentions and goals and think about it in that way. But again, I agree from societal perspective, it's very useful. It might not be like the truth, you know, about everything, but it's a very useful way of looking at it, because you filter out that nonsense that people will tell about their intentions and their objectives, and they, even while they might believe in them themselves, right? So this just makes it very kind of useless oftentimes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where the point about the immorality of delusion comes from, because it's like that's exactly it. You only really have control over examining that and monitoring for that in yourself. And if you don't do it, you will rationalize and moralize your self-interest in a way that harms other people. You will. Everybody's going to do that to a certain extent. Like, we're kind of designed to do that. That's a part of what a reasoning capacity is for, is to create a narrative that explains how what we're doing is noble intentions. And if we believe that narrative, even if it's not true, that's efficient self-deception in an evolutionary fitness context. And so, yeah, if you're not monitoring for that, you're gonna end up doing it, because there are massive social advantages to doing so, to being able to use coercion, theft, fraud, deceit in order to take things at other people's expense, while still maintaining an outward narrative that you're not doing that.
And it also makes it way easier to lie, right? If you really believe that crap that you tell yourself, because if you really believe it, then it's easy to convince others, you know, that's the case.
At that point, you're not you lie to yourself, and then you're not lying to anybody else.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're being honest, and we have instincts that are designed around detecting deception that you'll be able to overcome if you internalize lies to yourself.
Well, I like the idea that, Grant, you mentioned the word monitoring, because I think a lot of this is a monitoring problem. And by that I mean, like, you know, not exactly policing, but kind of policing on a regular basis. So in other words, there are, you know, the iterations of how often you check to see if a means is achieving a particular desirable agreed upon ends. It's sort of like when you think about the communist 5-year plans, it's just sort of like, well, they figured out the greatest increment in which to disguise the failures of given policies. Like, in other words, that increment was way too long in terms of like this of checking in and saying, hey, is this working, or is this producing a bad result? Is this actually harming? It would be like regular checkups of a doctor. And also, even though I hate to use tech analogies, it also reminds me of I guess a concept called version control. So if I'm working in a large development environment with lots of developers that are all working on essentially the same code base, the way that this happens is, so the product, the end in our case, is a software product that is functional, is maximally functional, maximally marketable, etc. On the way to that, there will be a lot of hands and fingers on this software. A lot of eyeballs and minds are essentially altering each other's code. And every time that you do that, if you're using there are various systems of version control, but like essentially you're signing off on your changes. So it's sort of like every change that you make, if it's a line of code, if it's 100 lines of code or 1,000, you're signing off on those changes, and there is a record of those changes that can be rolled back. And so what happens is, normally, like when the process gets rolling along sometimes QA is built in from the beginning, but at a certain point, quality assurance steps in and they say, okay, we're going to help also monitor each of these changes, because we know that you're in the business of creating, you're in the business of developing, you're in the business of trying to make things work, which will often cause all kinds of unforeseen errors. You'll break other people's code. And so like a really good quality assurance manager will just look at all of that, see the big picture, and say, okay, I understand how this change caused these butterfly effects over here, and we could roll back to this stage. And at each stage at each point of change, you have accountability built in, because again, you're logging into this version control system, and like whatever changes you make are not anonymous. They are signed by you, and they are regularly, like when the change is made is the moment at which the accountability can be traced back to. And we don't really have something similar to that right now. I think we have something that's much more akin to a 5-year plan, or maybe even just an N-year plan, a plan that infinitely expands the ends. The goalposts are moved continually forward, so that there almost isn't any check. There is no version control whatsoever. The thing just mutates, and the story mutates along with it. All of the narrative skullduggery used to rationalize all the failures kind of floats along. It's
I
this
think
floating point.
I think the version control system has contracted a virus and has overtaken the rest of the system. Something
Yeah,
like
I mean, well, it's sort of, or you have like basically a real evil, QA manager who's playing favorites, and who is blind to certain errors, and magnifying or even blaming things that blaming factors, blaming developers that had nothing to do with the bugs in question, right? Because they have they're playing their own metagame somewhere, where it's just sort of like, well, as long as the people that are on my team remain immune from blame, essentially, from accountability, then I don't care. The project can go on forever. The product could flop. I don't care. I'm just here to get a paycheck, get whatever I can out of the system, maybe steal and rob from it if I can. It doesn't particularly matter to me, because my loyalty is not to the end. My loyalty, such that it even exists, is to myself and like a few other people who are involved in my circles, who will also, shield me from accountability. And if you get enough of those people, essentially, you not only have a busted, non-functional product, the company collapses. Eventually, even those pirates go broke. You know, it's like I think that's kind of what we're faced with. It's sort of like this nihilism of the moment, this short, like a nihilism board of short-sightedness. So it's just sort of like, I don't need to get past the next code review. I just need to get past the next, or I don't need to get, I'm struggling. I want to get out of this metaphor right now. It's something like along the lines of,
I feel like
you know,
we don't actually have quality control. We have is like
yeah, that layer doesn't exist anymore.
it's anti-quality control. So the people getting punished for things are the ones who point out the bugs. Like that's what
Like Lysenko. Yeah, exactly. This is my point. Like it's
like
the
you're talking about
ones that it's the, yeah,
or like
yeah.
yeah, right. So I mean, like if you look at a concrete example, a couple of years ago in the pullout from Afghanistan, there was that colonel who was disgusted by the fecklessness of American military leadership and political leadership, and the billions of dollars of gear that fell into the hands of the Taliban and the whole rest of it. And he said so, and he was the only person in the entire military hierarchy to get punished. All of the generals, like no one was accountable. Basically, all he was doing was pointing out, like, here's a massive flaw in how we did this, and that happens all through society, it seems. Yeah. So like,
I mean,
and then
yeah, it's yeah.
then you're talking about the kind of nihilism that arises from that, where people stop trying to make good products or perform good services or do their jobs properly, and by and large, it just becomes this matter of like, okay, how can I extract as much as I can from this like collapsing system for myself, because you have no faith that the system could actually work. So, why put anything into that?
Yeah, behaviors that increase the likelihood of accountability are coded as low status by the current elite. So anything that anybody does that suggests, hey, this is a way that we could increase accountability. So say talking about Pfizer and emergency use authorization on vaccines and how those manufacturers are indemnified of liability. Somebody that brings that up, that's a low status thing to bring up. Like, why would you say that? That's going to increase vaccine hesitancy. Like, you're obviously a nut job conspiracy theorist, even though it's an obvious point. But it doesn't matter the veracity of the point. Like, what prevents people from adopting those beliefs is the status aspect of it. And the system, whether these people understand what's going on or not, like that is what's going on. The system demands status or demands account like illegibility with respect to accountability. Like it needs it to survive more than anything because they all suck. And if we could hold them accountable for how much they suck, it'd be over. And that's even if it's not explicitly understood, it's implicitly understood. And so that's the schism. That's the divide.
Yeah. So like William Briggs has been talking for years about, like, he always comes back to expertocracy, right? You've got this set of people who, like, largely in academia, some in think tanks, and they each kind of specialize in something. Like Cass Sunstein would certainly be an example of this class. But they don't usually wield sort of direct power in the sense of like they're making decisions as to what policy will be. They just suggest things. And they all agree with the suggestions that all of the other experts make. And then the political actors who actually implement these things, well, they're not really responsible either because it's not their idea. They're just listening to expert advice and they're implementing, best practices. So like, and and there's this incredible loyalty inside that expert class because, of course, like you said, like if one of them goes rogue and starts saying, hey, for instance, lockdowns don't seem to have worked, or these vaccines don't seem to be very effective, that undermines the entire rest of the system kind of by implication. And they all sort of tacitly understand that. So they're completely unskeptical as to like anything that other experts in other fields say, they just kind of like, take it as read that, it's all true. Um, and then collectively
Now
maintain.
extrapolate that to AI. Extrapolate that to
Oh,
AI
dude.
because that's
Oh,
the
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
so
yeah. No, totally,
because the
totally.
experts won't even be human at that point.
Well,
The,
yeah. And it's that the AI is so shitty too. I mean, if you look at the things that ChatGPT will write, it's a bullshit generator. Like it'll make stuff up that is just utterly nonsensical, or is quite shallow, or both. Um,
But then again, so are white papers of big corporations, right?
oh yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, uh, was it Alexander Svetsky who he joked that AI, like, or LLMs at least, are really kind of like a nitwit simulator, like a normie simulator, like,
yeah.
you know, they're incredibly good at, like, pumping out exactly the kind of like meaningless text that the managerial class loves to pump out there. That, like, looks like superficially when you glance at it, like, oh, a lot of thought went into this. This is like really, careful, extensive intellectual scholarly work here. And then when you dig into it, you're like, this is not nonsense. Um,
And because they have no minds, they have no consciousness, they have no bodies, they're disembodied. So it's sort of like the perfect fall guy that you're developing. It's not
Well,
really
right.
a guy,
Who's
but it's like
responsible? Is it the programming team? Is it the people who curated the training data? Was it the guy who wrote the
no, because
prompts? Like,
ML has run off the table there. They don't even know why it's doing things that it's doing. Whether
that's the
we're
point.
talking about LLMs or
That's the
NLPs.
point. There's no one in
Yeah.
the chain to get held responsible. I remember, like, years ago, this like 15 years ago, there was this incident, I think in South Africa, where they were experimenting with a robotic, like, self-targeting artillery piece, and someone was killed in the experiment, and it kind of kicked off this, like, kind of debate over, like, well, okay, like, when this kind of thing happens with a robot, like, who's responsible? Is it the engineer? Is it the programmer? Is it, because there's so many people involved in, like, developing the technology, that the responsibility is diffused across all of them. You can't really hold any one person accountable. You certainly can't hold the robot accountable. It has no moral agency of its own.
Well, that's why
Um,
I think what Grant says about like we just need to police means is probably the closest thing to an actual answer in the sense that like particular things that are done are the things that need to be held to account because we will never hold people accountable for their ends, and at some point they're not even going to be people to do that to. Like there'll be no one to threaten under color of law or under the gun or anything at all, which is I think explains why the elites like are so fascinated with AI development and why they're so just sort of enraptured with it and are talking about all of the various ways in which it's going to make life better and blah blah blah. I think ultimately what a lot of people deep down see is like this is the greatest thing, this is the greatest innovation in escaping accountability, which is what they're desperate to do in every single case. As a matter of fact, you can almost say that is fundamental to evil. The idea of escaping accountability, the idea of never being held responsible for what harms you commit, I think it's fundamental. It's sort of like the difference between, let's say, someone in a situation in war where they had to make a very difficult choice among a bunch of bad options. All of those options would probably lead to some kind of bad outcome, and it was just sort of so they had to juggle all of these bad outcomes and say, "Geez, which is the least bad in this situation?" And like in that sense, like when you were determining accountability for that purpose for that person, you would have to mitigate it based upon like really looking at the situation that they were in. You'd have to like use that as a principle and say like, okay, like this guy was in a very very bad position where like all of his choices were bad, and all of them would pretty logically and swiftly lead to some pretty terrible outcomes for someone or another. That's the purpose of justice. The purpose of justice is not just a sword that says this law says this right here, and you broke it in this technical way, and therefore your punishment should be this. That's not a concept of justice that can apply to human beings at all. And yet, I've heard that like you already have some district courts that are like trying to use AI as part, like build it into their sentencing system. And I'm just sort of like, well, what fresh madness is this? Because again, it's sort of like even the judges can be held accountable for things. Even the judges can be held accountable for their decisions in a system that's sane at all. So I think
if only in the court of public opinion. I mean, to the extent,
well, that matters because the court of public opinion sometimes has pitchforks and torches in tow.
It affects how they see themselves too. So at the very least, cognitive dissonance. But to the extent that accountability disincentivizes and punishes evil, it also incentivizes and rewards good to the exact same extent. There's another massive benefit to it. But what it tells you too is that people that meaningfully seek accountability, that's probably a good thing. That's probably somebody that you want to throw in with, especially if they actually accomplish increasing legibility in terms of accountability that affects them. Of course, it's not. It's just another trick if somebody's advocating for accountability for somebody else, but outside the system that they operate in. That's
why I think like admitting mistakes is important. Like that's an important judge of character for me. Like in assessing someone's character, I have to say, did they make mistakes? And did they know that they said it? And did they say, I made a mistake here? Do they, we're seeing this with COVID right now, like where we're seeing a bunch of people, scoundrels, who are essentially pointing backwards in time and saying, I was right at the time. This is a phenomenon that I knew was going to happen. You're seeing a lot of people that blundered big time, that coerced, that bullied, that threatened, that absolutely, that prayed for death in many cases openly, which I think is a pretty good signal of character and maybe something.
Yeah, like Sam Harris, for instance, like
Sam Harris, right? And he said, "I was right at the time."
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was actually watching him tie himself in verbal knots, trying to explain how he was right, even though he was wrong, and Brett Weinstein was wrong, even though he was right, because he was right for the wrong reasons, and Sam Harris was wrong for the right reasons. So Sam Harris was right. It's just like, no, you were just
the devil's tongue is forked for a reason.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like, bro, you were just wrong, like, and like,
right.
Yeah, and like, you could admit
I wrote
that
about
you're
this.
wrong. Like, and it's and it's something that's funny I've noticed, like, kind of professionally, is like it's almost like a marker of professional maturity is the ability to just kind of shrug when you get something wrong and be like, oh well, I got it wrong, and like, like, live and learn and you move on. Whereas like the sort of more like the younger professionals who still kind of have imposter syndrome, like they're loath to ever admit that they got something wrong. So it's like failing a test, and they always feel like they're being tested. I don't know.
Well, to some degree, they are.
They are, yeah. But these people are just, they're obviously not, they don't feel secure in their positions of like prestige and expertise, because they have this, and you can tell that because they have the inability to ever admit that they were wrong, even when everyone can see that they're wrong. The neocons, oh my God, that's another great example of this, right? I mean, these people have gotten every single foreign policy question of the last 30 years wildly wrong, disastrously, catastrophically wrong. Millions of people are dead because of all of their mistakes. And yet they continue. Like they're still like getting interviewed on like CNN and Fox News and writing op-eds in the New York Times, and like they just never admit that they're wrong about anything.
I mean,
So
if you're making the case that at the time I was right, then at least, when the exact same situation comes up, today, then at least, act differently. But I mean, these guys, they just do the same thing again, and that's kind of amazing.
right, like exactly, like so like conversely, you can take someone like Tucker Carlson, right? Like big media figure who's been around for a long time. Used to be pretty cringe, and he was definitely kind of a neocon back in the day. And he's just like straight up, like, yeah, I admit I was wrong about that. I was wrong about Iraq. I was wrong about Afghanistan. I was wrong about a lot, and he like admits that all the time. And actually, by doing that, he gains credibility because he's being honest. I remember Mark, you had a piece a while back talking about 9/11 and how that
Yeah.
affected you, like psychologically and emotionally, for like some period of years afterwards. I thought that was great. Like, I wish I had the balls to publish a mea culpa like that, because I went down the same like path for a few years there after 9/11. And in retrospect, it's just like, wow, did I ever fall for that one? Like, was I
Yeah,
ever
nobody
gullible?
nobody ever wants to
Yeah.
admit, like, not just that they were wrong, but that they fell for something. Like it's a weird thing. Like when
Especially
you're
especially something monstrous,
yeah, right.
which is
That's the
I mean,
problem.
I thought Obama was a great guy, man.
seriously.
Well,
When he was when
that's
he
your
was
business,
first elected,
man.
yeah,
I was already enough of a conspiracy theorist by
yeah.
2008
No,
that
that
like when
was
That
Obama
right.
was
was
running, and
That,
all my lefty friends were like, he's the Messiah, and I was like, you realize he's working directly with Goldman
yeah.
Sachs, like.
No, that was right before my awakening. But you can't. I mean, you can be really cringe if you have no clue.
no, I agree. I was just making fun. I mean, I think you're right, Luke. Like that kind of rabbit duck illusion happens a lot more often than most people are willing to accept. It's just sort of like that. Even 9/11 wasn't the first time that I was wrong, but it's sort of like it probably was the biggest error that I ever made. It was the biggest, like, let's put it this way, it was the biggest game that I fell for. And like, so to admit that publicly, the point I was trying to make with that article was that I'm doing something that's going to hurt me in some way right now. By admitting wrong, I know that I'm basically opening myself up to endless critique by people that are not necessarily genuine actors. So that's the flip side of that. Like it's not exactly courageous, because the people that would use my admission of error against me, um, there's no mollifying them. There's no way in which I can win the game that they're playing, because they are always right and I will always be wrong, whether I'm proven right or wrong. Like that's the accountability trick there. It's sort of
I
like the
think
people that are playing the game of I'm always right and let me justify it ex post facto. It's like you can't play any kind of useful game with those people.
Well, you
Nothing
were
productive
talking
can come of that.
you were talking earlier about this kind of like cybernetic control loop, um, in terms of like keeping 5-year plans on track, by and like how accountability plays into that, right? Like that you're constantly checking, okay, do the means make sense with our ends? Like, this is a similar kind of thing where like we're all human, we make mistakes, we get things wrong, and when you do and you admit it and it's obvious that you learned, actually that, at least with a certain, at least with that fraction of the population to whom like things like truth and competence matter, uh, actually tends to increase your credibility, because like they can see that you're engaging in this feedback loop. Whereas the people who are like just refuse to ever admit they got something wrong, they're obviously, there's no
Right.
feedback there.
yeah,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it's another example of elite status and what governs it. So like very clearly admitting that you were wrong is low status in given the current elite hierarchy. It is absolutely low status, because the more elite you are, the more you represent institutional power. And by admitting you're wrong, you undermine institutional power, which is in the class interest of the elite. And that's what you all, like, Mark, when you were talking about, I sense I'm opening myself up here. What you're sensing, because you're intelligent, is you are sensing how that behavior is going to lower your status in that hierarchy. But just like John said, like, what I think we need, and what is critical ultimately to having a circulation of the elites, is a broad-based alternative status hierarchy that is based on the exact inverse. So more accountability, and a part of accountability in this manner, and increasing the legibility of accountability, is admitting that when you were wrong, and taking responsibility. And it demonstrates epistemic humility. It demonstrates that you're not likely to be delusional. And it demonstrates that you're not hypocritical in a lot of ways, because we can't help but attack other people for being wrong, and wanting other people to admit when they're wrong. And so if we aren't willing to do that ourselves, usually inherently hypocritical. But I like this whole conversation, as it has shifted over to talking about admitting wrongdoing. I think this is another example of something that has very clear status implications. And to the elite, that's why the neocons get away with it. CNN endorses it all the way up and down. They just delight in never admitting that they're wrong. And they look at people who admit they're wrong as stupid rubes that aren't sophisticated enough to engage in narrative propaganda at scale that's necessary to maintain their control and dominance. And nobody, if you adopt that frame, like, you're never going to beat them at that game, because
And you
they
can
are
and you
elite.
can see that in even in corporations as well, right? Where you have this hardcore like dominance hierarchy guys, but on a very primitive level, right? That just would never admit that they are wrong in anything, and see that as totally like weak to even entertain the idea, right? And sometimes they get away with that, and these are like some of the most unpleasant bosses or colleagues you can have. Oftentimes they don't get away with that if it's too hardcore, but yeah, I can see that even like in regular situations, that type of person. And if you scale that up to like a powerful politician or cabal, that's basically what these people are, right? It's almost it's almost like a psychological defect, right? It's pretty insane if you think about it.
I agree with a lot of what both of you said. Like, but let me take a step back and try to steelman this for a second. Like, if I look at what I wrote in The Art of Being Wrong, someone can look at that, someone honest can look at that and say, but Mark, you didn't really take accountability because you lost nothing. So in other words, they could even point to the fact that I operate under a pseudonym and say, wow, you've really lost nothing. Like whatever credibility you've lost, you can escape in a heartbeat, because like you've essentially set up this escape route for yourself through your name. And even if they accepted that, okay, maybe I have some sort of meta accountability through my name because I'm a writer and people recognize me by my work. They could also say, but where's the physical accountability for what you admitted to, for the mistake that you made? Because that mistake definitely had effects, even though they may be way down the chain of butterfly effects or network effects, whatever you want to call them. The fact of the matter is, the way that I viewed reality at that moment, and the decisions that I was making, all of the small ones that may have led to these larger consequences, it's like, have I really paid for them? So that's one way that like someone could look at that honestly and say, well, that doesn't really compute. And the other way that I think that they could look at it is that they could say, like, well, someone like what Grant was saying and what Luke was saying about the idea of these different kinds of hierarchies that we could potentially help to build and nourish and maintain. It's sort of like another criticism I can see is somebody would say, like, yeah, but if you're smart enough and sly enough and cunning enough, maybe you could metagame those hierarchies as well. You know what I mean? Like that there might be the types of individuals who can somehow corrupt those systems from within. And like that's the real game, I think. The game is something along the lines of, I agree. I'm just steel manning here because I agree. Ultimately, it comes down to trust. It's sort of like we build trust, and trust is essentially the currency that keeps these systems, that keeps them safe and maintains them. But like somebody, I'm just curious if anybody has any answer to that. Like, what about metagamers?
Well,
And maybe they've existed
yeah.
in
Well,
history.
I mean, like in terms of like losing things, like, like something like 9/11, where if you go like, if you fell for that really hard at the time, you did lose something. I mean, like, you lost maybe some illusions about yourself and came back to your senses, right? Like you may well have lost a little bit of respect for yourself. Like, oh, geez, that's incredibly like, going to say embarrassing, but I think it's a bit more serious than that. Because you realize that you were supporting monstrous things, and those are kind of spiritual damage to you, right? So there wasn't a loss there, absolutely, and but then by sort of taking accountability for it and saying, okay, I was wrong about that. I fell hard for that trick, and believed in and supported like bad things. That does actually, I mean, I think that makes up for it to a certain degree. It corrects for it. It's different if you're at the decision making level where you're saying go invade that country or go torture those Afghan guys taken by extraordinary rendition. That's a different level of accountability that's called for in that case. But yeah, it's just
I,
one thought to like kind of like respond to your.
I, to your point about them trying to metagame it, like they're already trying, obviously, right? Because they believe they don't believe in this version of morality and accountability. They think accountability is for suckers, for people that are inferior to them. It's an in to the extent to which the next 100,000 years, 100 to 1,000 years play out, it'll kind of prove who's right. Like, are they going to be able to get away with it forever? And is civilization going to do this melt up and reach this tech singularity where this small elite few of hyper quote unquote rationalist, utilitarian consequentialist, but really just power maximization all the way down type mentality, like did those people end up running society or not? They are very confident that they will, and people even that aren't elite, that are in dissident spaces, view those strategies as the winning strategies and think that like they want to circulate the elites, but they want to implement the exact same strategies because they accept that fundamental premise that morality is for suckers. And like time will tell if they're wrong. I think they're certainly wrong, and I'm willing to stake my life on it, or at least my life's purpose is like I'm aligned against those forces, and
I
I'm
think
willing
I
to
think I think
destroy
that's
them across.
wrong too. No, I think you're right about that. Like the arc of society has been trending more towards like decentralization uh, rather than centralization for some time. And there doesn't seem to be any sign of that slowing down. And to do that, to have an effectively decentralized society, you need some kind of coordinating mechanism. Um, and a functioning high level moral system with built in accountability to it is actually probably one of the best coordinating mechanisms you have. Uh, so I strongly suspect that like we're going to see something like that spread. And the people sort of participating in that system and doing well within it are going to start sort of accruing prestige and status and becoming that sort of rival elite that ultimately sort of replaces these lying shits that have been dominating everything for the last generations. Like and I don't know, maybe it's like a bit of like wishful thinking on my part. I just want them to go
I don't
away.
know. No,
But
I
like,
actually think
but like,
I kind of see the same sort of like the same kind of conclusions drawing near. Like before we started, I mentioned like Grant's working on something that I was interested in because I was working on something similar that I was calling the new and improved knighthood. And I think so it's like so you have traditionalists on the one hand, and like a lot of them are fairly short-sighted and kind of ignorant, and they just say like, well, let's just replicate systems from the past, not understanding that like it's sort of like we learn from the past. It doesn't mean that we repeat the mistakes of the past, but it doesn't mean also that the past is entirely thrown out. So like in a system of knighthood where a knighthood that was I hesitate to say perfected, but like that was improved in many ways, that we looked at the concept and we said, okay, we looked at the concept of chivalry, for example, and we said, how can we improve this? How can we reshape this fairly good idea into something that's very, very useful, a set of heuristics and a as Grant was saying, is sort of an alternative hierarchical system or an alternative method of determining value. Like if we can take some of those lessons and project them into the current day, like maybe you could have something like a system that aligns both with individual morality or straddles individual morality and sort of a concept or a conceptual framework that kind of can link people through common conduits into a new chivalry. Like I for example, like when Grant said hypocrisy is essentially evil, and it's something that I think everyone can agree with. Like, or I think you could even take it a step further in saying lying is something that everyone can agree is evil, that it is contrary to the truth, that even for someone who is struggling with the idea of a single objective truth can say like, well, a liar, though, is someone who can't be trusted in any circumstance, whether there is an objective truth or not. At base, if somebody lied to you once, and they can lie to you again, and like so taking
well, I mean,
something a
like,
concept like
and
that, yeah,
context does need to be taken into account, right? Like,
it
for
does,
instance,
but
like, like
Why?
if you're hiding someone in your attic who you've agreed to protect from the Gestapo, for instance, and they come by and you're like, no, there's no one here. Like, you're lying, right, through your teeth.
right,
Right,
Lying
but like,
to tie it into
that's
the
that battlefield. Yeah, yeah.
lying to your Schmittian enemies is not hypocritical nor delusional.
No,
You
no,
know,
no. But I'm saying
exactly.
those are special use cases, because what I was really thinking of was lying as a means to enhance your own power or authority, like lying for advantage, essentially. And like you're right, that requires a process. We can't just say every lie is equal, but we can in some way say that every lie isn't that there probably isn't such a thing as a noble lie. Maybe that's a controversial thing to say, but I've seen this throughout my life, because like the problem is, and you were talking about this with memes, Grant, like the problem is that like we can't allow, we have to restrict the size of that opening into the system. Like that has to be ruthlessly policed. Like the idea of somebody saying that they told a lie for the a greater good really needs to be put under the most intense scrutiny and microscope, because that's where the greatest villains hide out, I think, is in that concept, the concept of the noble lie. It is when you look at Anthony Fauci, he is essentially an anthropomorphized version of that concept. He's just saying, well, I told lies, but for the right reason. He was doing it in real time, which I thought was interesting. You want to talk about accountability, the sort of the
yeah,
back and forth on
him
masks, on every policy. Yeah.
him admitting to that was crazy, and how people just didn't write him off. is just proof of this overall concept that, and all the elite saw him say that, and they're like, yeah, that's high status. Like everybody else was, you know, in a new broad-based consensus populism was like, that guy is an evil dirtbag. And so this ties into the inherent contradiction and vulnerability of liberalism, like classical liberalism, universalism. It's tied into this. And the way that you get around it is that you use the Schmittian friend enemy distinction, because it's necessary, because there are elements within liberal society, and if you too broadly apply that universalism to literally everybody, then that will be used against you to destroy you by your enemies that do not hold those universalist values, do not hold classical liberal values. They don't. They pretend to, they use them against you, and they don't. And so why is that first principle non-hypocrisy? Is because it explicitly paints those individuals as immoral. And so that accounts for lying. It accounts for all these means that seem questionable. It's that the means are hypocritical. It's that they are delusional, and that's tied into everything else. So I'll close us out on that note, because we've been losing through attrition, because we've been had some good conversation beforehand. But you know, I'm going to include a link to John's article that is about non-compliance with systems that there's no accountability, because it's highly relevant to this conversation. And then I'll also include a link to what I just wrote right before starting this off. And thank you all again for joining us for another Tonic discussion, and we'll see y'all next time.